Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and this one is a huge, massively important adventure. This is one of the biggest games we ever ran ever, and it is literally the death of the main character. And that's not like a clickbait kind of a thing or something. It really was the death of the main character. Um, if you have been following my podcast, you know that the very first adventure ever was about the Eldar being created by this race called the Old Ones, right? And the Eldar were these sort of genetically engineered beings created to fight this war out among the stars. And they were supposed to fight this race called the Star Gods. And the Eldar were these powerful cosmic beings. And at the end of the day, their creators, the old ones, just left. They bugged out. And the star gods had been banking everything on being able to devour the old ones. So, unable to do that, they went into hibernation. And the Eldar, and specifically our protagonist, right, who wasn't even given a name, he was just cannon fodder. He had no purpose. And so time passes and he finds his way to Earth. And when he arrives in ancient Ireland, the Irish called him Dagda. And he was the inspiration for various Celtic myths and legends, right? And he was like a Highlander in the sense that he never died. He never aged, he never got old. And he was at that point in his life immune to most forms of damage. So he's surviving through the centuries. And then as he would interact with these different cultures around the world, he would inspire various myths and legends and stuff, right? So when he went to Germany, they called him Beowulf, which, by the way, means bear. When he went to England, he became known as King Arthur. And by the way, Arthur or Artorias means bear. When he met William Shakespeare, he was known as Oberon, and we use the French spelling where it's Auberon, which means bear, right? And so, time and time again, he's sort of a king, he's a leader guy, and the more primitive cultures for Europe, right, are calling him bear because if you think about what a bear is to those cultures, it's basically the apex animal. You know what I mean? So it all makes sense. And and then up into the modern day, he had chosen the name John Redbridge. And he was the through line for this entire game world. In a lot of ways, it was his story of all of the adventures he had. And there was an ebb and a flow to his life, highs and lows. And this podcast has chronicled all of that, right? And in the 90s, for a long time, we ran him in GURPS Supers. And I want to say something really quick about GURPS for a minute, because in a way I'm defending myself. Because at the end of the day, now I realize he's a Mary Sue, but I didn't know what that was back then. And so here's the thing in GURPS, for instance, they have an advantage called status, where the lowest possible thing would be like someone who was just had nothing at all in life, right? Just an absolute nobody. That would be like status level 0. And then it goes up, I want to say up to like level 8, and that's like an emperor or something who's running the show, right? And so as he would level up, he would put points into status, which meant he was becoming more and more important in his respective society. And that was just one advantage that GURPS had. They also had stuff like wealth. So as time went on, he became more and more wealthy. He accumulated more stuff, right? But all of these different metrics, just the fact that he'd survived as an RPG character for so long meant that eventually all those things were maxed out. So that's why he was a Mary Sue, is in a way, GURPS kind of promotes it. If you play long enough, it's sort of inevitable, right? So that's what happened with him. And not only that, when I was younger, I had grown up on fiction, whether we were talking about, say, James Bond, who always gets the girl, or Captain Kirk, who always gets the girl. We have kind of a different attitude about that now, I think. Back then, when I was young, when I was 20 years old or something, I saw that as another one of these things of, I would put stuff on his character sheet that meant that, girls liked him and that he did well in that arena, right? So, once again, it was a very Mary Sue kind of thing that he was, the ultimate ladies' man, just as he was whatever, physically he was the strongest and he was the best looking and he was the most wealthy and just across the board, right? And he didn't start off that way. Like I just said, he was nameless cannon fodder in the beginning, right? But he established himself over time and he worked himself up until most characters in the game world regarded him as the main guy. And I don't mean the existing characters that are usually in our games NPCs. I mean the actual player characters. When somebody would make an original character, that's how they saw him. And part of it was because he was always really helpful. He would always come to the aid of the players. If the chips were down and it seemed like they were all going to die, I was keeping him around as a GMPC and kind of a safety net. So maybe instead of killing off a whole party of heroes, he would show up and save the day. And so because of that too, he was beloved, right? Well, so I had a friend. I mean, he's still a friend. I don't know why I said that in the past tense. I have a friend named Greg Sheets. Shout out to Greg if he's listening to this. He was one of the game masters, before me, and he didn't like the bear. And I think he has probably had a change of heart over the years. And I think he probably likes John Redbridge now, or Dagda, or Arthur, or Oberon, or, any of the other names he's gone by over the years. I think he gets it a little more now, in a way. But back then, I think Greg's attitude was that he thought if it was a DC game, he thought Superman should be the main guy. And if it was like a Marvel game, he thought somebody like Spider-Man or Captain America should be like the main guy. And he didn't like that it was an original character. I think it was really that simple. So Greg was, well, and Greg knew what a Mary Sue was, and I didn't. And so Greg was kind of always complaining about him and so on and so forth. And at one point, I can't quite remember how this came to be, but somebody said something about he has to die eventually. Like it's just how it's going to be. Is sooner or later this character will die. And I agreed with that. I said, sure, everybody dies eventually. And they said, so let's play a game. This was like around the year 2000, I think. They said, let's play a game that takes place sometime in the future. We were not specific when that would be. But sometime in the future, years from what was at then the present, again, around the year 2000. Let's tell the story of how he dies. And we did. We played it out. And I'll get to the story here in a minute because there's some other stuff I want to say to set it up. So we did that. And everybody was kind of sad, but at the same time, they said, yeah, but that's the future. So, at least it's not here yet. And the very next game that we ran was set in the present, not the future, right? So he was alive and well. And he appeared in countless more games where he was alive and well. And I don't want to say people forgot about it. They never forgot about it, but it just didn't seem so bad, right? And so so then let's skip ahead to 2020. March of 2020 is when the world goes into lockdown, right? Everybody's suddenly in quarantine. Tons of people are getting sick. I actually did lose some friends. Um, I knew a woman named Susan Mitchell. She passed away, and she was a friend of mine. And so we were taking it very seriously, And so then the day comes when I get it, and I couldn't breathe. So my son, who had a learner's permit, rushed me to the emergency room, and I had the forethought to take my laptop and charger with me because I had a feeling that I wasn't coming home. And so the hospital was, of course, swarmed with people. And the doctor, I think, was in a bad mood because of how busy they were. And so it took him a little while before he came in to see me. And then when he did, they gave me a test and I tested positive, and he just looks right at my son and says, say your goodbyes. Your dad is too fat to survive this. And we were shocked. And he told me, he's like, I'll give you a couple minutes to say goodbye to your son. Like goodbye, goodbye, like forever. Um, but you're never going home again, is what he told me. And I hugged my son and we cried and we thought this guy knew what he was talking about, obviously, spoiler, I'm still here. But we said our goodbyes. I told my son to take care of my wife and daughter. Um, I told him he was the game master now, stuff like that. Um, I said a lot of things. A lot of things were said that day. And he left and they put me in a room. And I was in that room for a long time. And I had my computer, so I was able to call home and I was able to talk to him. And I was on oxygen, so I had like the tubes going up my nose and stuff like that, like 24/7. And I was very weak. And at one point, I could like barely move at all. I was practically paralyzed. And so I would talk to my family. They were talking to me almost all day long because they thought they would never get a chance to do that again. Um, like I remember calling my wife's cell phone and I left her a message and she still has it actually. And I told her, there's going to be a time come when I'm not around anymore and you're going to miss me. And I just want to let you know I love you, it's stuff like that. So with all that going on, um, at one point, somebody, and I can't remember who it was asking me about the game and the idea of if the game would die with me and that'd just be the end of it. And I told him, I said, I hope not, you know. And at that point, we'd been playing it for 35 years. And I said, I wasn't the first game master. I've been a GM longer than anybody else, but I was not the first. And I was like, I don't think I should be the last. I think other people should pick up the torch and carry it and, so on and so forth. And so my son said, he was going to run the game. He'd be the new game master and he'd play with his friends and so on and so forth. And I was pretty happy about that. My son grew up not only hearing me and my friends play the game, he would play in the games. He was a fan of the characters. From his point of view, the characters in the game, he liked that just as much as other kids like characters from cartoons or comics or video games or whatever. He loved the game. So I thought, man, he's the perfect GM, you know. And so then the conversation came around to John Redbridge, who was the guy I played more than any other character. And I said, do you want to keep him alive? And I was fine with it. I said, you understand the character, you could play the character. Um, and everybody unanimously said that they wouldn't have the heart to do that. That any game that John Redbridge would appear in, it would just make him want to cry and it would make him miss me. So I said, well, you know what? Greg Sheets ran this game years ago where he died, and we never said what year that game took place. Let's just say it took place in 2020 then. And that's it. It's already taken care of then. So we did. We did that. And the story is pretty simple. We had based it on the 1986 animated Transformers the movie. Kind of loosely, but still. So the gist is that in the 90s, I had ran all these games with this group called the Draconians. And they are a political group of reptilian supremacists. When I created them, I was inspired. I mean, inspired is not the right word because it's not a positive thing, but I looked at what Germany was doing in World War II as well, what would you call that? Just like the most notorious villains of all time or whatever, right? Like a lot of people in fiction have based fictional armies on Germany, right? So I did the exact same thing, except we replaced the idea of blonde hair and blue eyes and all that Aryan stuff with sort of like you're green and scaly and cold-blooded and, that kind of thing. Reptilian traits, right? That's what they thought was superior. So they would conquer multiple planets throughout the universe. And basically, if you were a reptilian, you could join them. If you were not, they would get rid of you. So a lot of the ones that were running the show were actual dragons. And then underneath them, there was kind of a hierarchy of then sort of like generals or whatever you want to call it. They were like dragon men or kind of like in Dungeons and Dragons. They have the idea of dragonborn, whatever you want to call it. That's basically the gist. And since it was a superhero game, we said a lot of those guys were about the size of the Incredible Hulk. We thought they should be big since an actual dragon is like huge. And then they were, smaller dragon men that were kind of skinny. And then below them were like just lizard men. You know what I mean? And so they had been reoccurring villains. And I had certain members of the Draconian army, like there was a guy named Zareth, who was a popular villain that we would bring back time and time again. And so every once in a while, a hero would like shoot him in the arm or something and he'd lose an arm. So then when he would come back, I would give him a cyborg arm since they were this, spacefaring race from another planet. We thought, well, that's kind of cool. And I was really inspired there by a lot of the artwork for a role playing game called Rifts. That was a big inspiration for the dragon, the Draconians and the Dragon Men and stuff. So the main leader of these guys is this massive dragon. I mean, a kaiju Godzilla-sized dragon. He's bigger than any traditional dragon, and his name is Zaxus. And by the way, the name there was a mashup of. I had a poster in my room when I was in high school for an old arcade game called Zaxxon. And when the Transformers Generation 2 comic came out, they had a villain in that called Jaxus. So I took the first part of Zaxxon and the second part of Jaxus, and that's where the name Zaxus comes from. But yeah, he was a major villain, he was a recurring villain, so on and so forth. So the idea is they actually team up with the other race that were reoccurring villains that were the Pomeranians or lobster men, right? And they were cool, but they were more kind of street level guys. They were weaker. So like something I did a lot because when we would play back in the day, especially if it was like we're kind of eating pizza and drinking a few beers, and I wasn't wanting a whole lot of math under those circumstances. So I would take sort of the average low level draconian that they would encounter the most, and I'd say he was all tens. So in DC Heroes, he was Dex 10, Strength 10, Body 10, IQ 10, Willpower 10, Mind 10, so on and so forth, right? With the Pomeranians, they were sevens, which is still pretty good, but it's a little more in the ballpark of like peak human, right? Whereas the draconian guys are a little more like a Hulk level kind of thing, right? So so at any rate, they team up, and again, Greg Sheets wrote this adventure, he ran this adventure, and so when characters begin playing it, draconian and Pomeranian ships come to Earth in this armada, and there are these rings in the adventure that Greg put around the major cities of the world. And then each one projects like a semi-spherical force field over top of the city. And then the idea is the people who were inside are trapped inside, and the bad guys are inside before they turn on the force field, by the way. But so they are trying to do as much damage as possible before reinforcements can arrive. And so John Redbridge had been in space doing stuff for quite a while, actually, when he gets word of this. So when he comes to Earth from space, even he with his great strength can't bust through these force fields. And because Greg ran this actually in GURPS Supers, GURPS has an advantage called invulnerability to all kinetic damage. And that's what he gave the force fields. So they are literally just infinitely durable, and there's nothing you can do to break through one. And so John Redbridge is like, all right, I'll fly into the ground and I'll come up underneath, right? But it turns out this ring projects a thing underground too. So as you dig through dirt or whatever, you eventually hit force field there too. So the force fields are a sphere. And then kind of that equator of this sphere, if that's what we want to call it, is this metal ring that is at ground level, right? And it's like huge, we're talking about a scale where that ring, would be like maybe, I don't know, 100 feet tall or something, right? Like it's good sized. And so while they're on the inside, the bad guys start to fight the various heroes, and it is a losing battle. and characters are dying left and right. And there was a particularly stupid moment where Hacker, who's this character who has been cloned a million times, he's died a bunch, he always gets cloned, blah blah blah. Hacker's genius idea was he would shoot buildings and knock them down on the enemies. And that worked, but like everybody else had to tell his player, John, how smart is it that like you're trying to stop them from destroying buildings by killing them by destroying buildings? Like, you know, and John didn't see the problem. He's like, "What? What are you talking about?" Um, so that was happening. Um, Jay, who was the GM right before me, Jay Mora, he was playing a character named Tixake Films that was kind of like this space pirate kind of guy. Um, I want to almost liken him to like a Han Solo, but honestly, he's darker than that. You know, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but he was in a trench coat running around and he was like shooting these guys and things are looking really bad. And then in the bubble that's over New York City, it becomes clear that this is where Zaxxas is. And Zaxxas again is like the size of Godzilla. He's this gigantic dragon. And then kind of like from like the waist down, his entire lower half is a gigantic tank. So think of it sort of like there are Marvel villains called the Reavers. I think they're called the Reavers. I might be wrong about the name there, but at any rate, the one guy has like a tank for a lower half. We jokingly use the phrase tank butt. He has a tank butt. So that's what Zaxxas has too, is this giant tank butt, but it is massive. So I mean the tank treads and stuff, this is all like what would you even compare it to that would be that big? Maybe like the Jawa sand crawler or something from Star Wars. Like it's just massive, right? Like the tank treads themselves are probably like 10 stories tall or something. We're just talking like this massive scale. And so he's in the water, kind of like between New York and the Statue of Liberty, where he's got his back turned to the Statue of Liberty. And he's kind of like coordinating everything that's going on in the city. And so John Redbridge, by the way, has a he has an evil twin who is here that's part of this massive combined army. And then Powerhouse, his evil twin, is here too. And they are kind of overseeing stuff from this ship. And they're ordering the lobster men to go to this area where there's a computer network. And it's almost like a heroic version of Skynet. And so they send them there to where all the servers and stuff like that are. And they're like, hold your position and don't let anybody enter these buildings. Like, enter the buildings, terminate any of the humans that are here, and then hold your position. And like, and by the way, you know, I think I said this earlier, the Draconians have been upgraded with these cybernetic features, right? And so they did the same thing to the lobstermen. And this was the first time we ever saw cyborg lobstermen in our game. And the lobstermen are like pretty excited about this because the lobstermen have been sort of like getting beat down hard by the heroes this whole time. And they feel like this is their chance and that they're finally going to come back from like the brink of extinction. And, you know, like things are finally looking up for the lobstermen is sort of where they're at with all this. And they're super excited to have these cyborg parts and stuff now that's making them tougher. And so the heroes fight some more, and then when the heroes are trying to take back these computer centers. The one guy up on the starship whose name is Patrick, and he had his throat slit at one point, so it screwed up his voice, and he talks like Chris Latta, which, if you're my age, you grew up with the voice of Chris Latta as the voice of Cobra Commander on G.I. Joe. He was the voice of Starscream, for Transformers. So Patrick has this like high pitched, kind of raspy, messed up voice, and it's the big standout line from the game is he gives this order. He like turns on a communication system so the entire bad guy army can all hear this, and he says, "Detonate the lobster men." And the lobster men look at each other like, "What did he just say?" And all of a sudden they all explode. And so it turns out when they put cybernetic parts into these guys, they put a bomb in each one of them. And so between the metal bits and the hard shell and everything, each one of these guys is like a 2-ton grenade. And it is just massive. There's just explosions everywhere. And kind of like everywhere around the world where there are important computer servers and stuff like that, they all get taken out in this moment. And so things are looking really, really bad. It really does seem like Earth's darkest hour to a lot of the heroes. And a bunch of heroes died in those explosions. A bunch of other heroes are laying in the street, and they had been knocked out. Maybe they're waking up, and it's like they have one hit point now that they've woken up, and they're like, "Well, what do we even do? How do we stop this?" And so we go back to John Redbridge, and he's been studying the ring, and he found a door. And I remember asking Greg, I was like, "So when they made this door out of adamantium or whatever, when they put it together, did they use like adamantium screws or did they use like normal screws?" And Greg thinks about it for a minute. He's like, "I guess they would have just used normal screws and not thought about it." And I was like, "Great. If everything else is unbreakable, at least the fasteners that hold this door together are breakable. I want to destroy this door." And so he finally manages to get in. And once he's in, again, we're channeling Transformers the movie. So there's this moment where Optimus Prime shows up and he's driving through the city, and you can see the reflections of the bad guys and the chrome grill of the truck. We basically do that, where Redbridge comes in and he's just taking out guys left and right. He jumps up in the air and is flying. He's shooting down at villains because he can shoot, energy blasts out of his hands. And he fights his way to where Zaxxas is. And it's important to note at this point that there's two other characters here. And John Redbridge has like a million kids, right? And these are two of them. And they are both the sons of the Morrigan. Because if you go all the way back to the beginning of the story, where John Redbridge and the Morrigan were aliens, they were nameless aliens, right? And they come down to Earth, they come to ancient Ireland, and Dagda and Morrigan are the names they were given. And they became lovers. And she had long black hair. She was associated with actual ravens, like crows and stuff. And she was kind of like the goddess of war slash goddess of death, whereas he was kind of the god of life and the god of fertility. And, but it was like an opposites attract kind of thing with these two. And so they have multiple kids, but the two that we're talking about right now is their oldest is Rad. And I've talked about him in other videos on this channel. Check those out if you want to see him. And then Rad's younger brother is Aramis. And so this is the moment in Transformers the movie with Cup and Hot Rod. And Hot Rod says, "I've got to go help Prime." And Cup says, "Stay away, lad. That's Prime's fight." And Hot Rod doesn't listen, and he runs in and he gets involved in the fight between the main good guy and the main bad guy, right? So we do the exact same thing. Aramis says, I've got to help Dad. And Rad says, stay away, kid. That's Dad's fight. And Aramis runs in anyways. And so what happens is John Redbridge is fighting Zaxxas, and this is just the fight to end all fights, where they're just doing these insane levels of damage to each other. That's one of the reasons we had Zaxxas be out in the water a little bit, because first of all, those tank treads are so huge that it's not like he's underwater. It's like he's parked in a mud puddle practically, right? He's just such a massive scale. And so when one of them misses a shot, it's like hitting water and it's like evaporating just like 100 tons of seawater or something. And then there's like steam and fog everywhere. And there's these neon energy blasts getting shot around at each other, you know. And John Redbridge has Excalibur because he used to be King Arthur, right? So he has Excalibur. And we had done this thing where there's I want to say it's called a geese. I'm probably saying it wrong, but it's in Changeling the Dreaming. And we had ran that for a while with the John Redbridge character. But it's this thing where somebody will kind of like, there'll be like a prophecy. And it's like this inescapable fate. And so on the one hand, Excalibur does killer damage, but the downside of him using it was that this prophecy was when he does die, he'll die by his own sword. And so there's this moment where the sword gets knocked out of his hand and it's spinning kind of end over end through the air, and it goes over to the side and lands on its side in sort of like the sand of the beach. And so Aramis grabs it, flies towards his dad, and he decides to throw it at Zaxxas, like the way you would do like a throwing axe. And so on Zaxxas's turn, he can actually teleport. Kind of like the Battlestar Galactica, how it has like a jump drive. It's like that basically, right? So Zaxxas changes positions. And then the sword that was flipping end over end lands right in the chest of Redbridge, right through his heart. And so Redbridge drops. He just falls out of the air and hits water, you know. And he's leaking glowing blue blood into the water. And he manages to, you ever see in a movie, like a martial arts movie or something, where someone throws a knife at you and like the guy sort of like claps his hands together and it stops the knife? And you know how his hands are both flat, but they're on either side of the blade. So he's doing that to the sword and he's like slowly pulling it out of his own chest. And he gets it out of his chest and he's still going. And so that is a power called mind over matter. And so it means the damage has been done, but he's not going to feel it until the fight is over. And Aramis is freaking out. And everybody who saw this is freaking out. And they completely blame Aramis for this. And by the way, to this day in the game, completely blame Aramis for this. Um, and so, you know, Zaxxas had teleported to a new location. Redbridge goes over there. They fight. And at the end of the day, Redbridge lands on top of his head. That's kind of like a superhero landing, but he brings the sword all the way down into the very top of his skull. And something we had always done with the sword was the idea that it had a bunch of powers we gave it, but one of them was we ripped off the original 8-bit Zelda where you could shoot lasers out of the sword. So we said that these energy blasts that Redbridge can shoot out of his hands, if he shoots it through the sword adds column shifts to how much damage that does. So he stabs the sword all the way to the hilt into the bad guy's skull so that the tip of the sword is coming out in brain. And then he fires his energy blast into there. He does a thing called pushing the attack, which means you roll to see if you can do more damage than you normally do. And he succeeded. And then on top of all that, he gets a critical success where he rolled a bunch of doubles. And so what that looks like is he comes down on top, stabs the dragon right in the very top of the head with the sword, shoots energy through the sword, and it blows the dragon's eyes out of its skull sockets. And its mouth opens up, and there's like blue smoke coming out of its mouth, and he just completely blew its brains out, literally. So the dragon's head now comes crashing down on the beach, and it hits sand, and sand kind of puffs out to the sides, you know. And so Zaxxas, who has been this ultimate bad guy of the Draconian Empire for years and years and years, is dead. And we did not do the thing from Transformers the movie where when Prime beats Megatron, Megatron gets sort of recycled into a new character called Galvatron. We did not do that. Zaxxas was dead for good. And then Redbridge drops down on the beach and he's on his hands and knees. And as his heart is beating, it's pumping this glowing blue blood out of his body through this just massive hole in his chest. And everybody freaks out. And now that Zaxxas has been beaten, various high level Draconians now are going to fight over who gets to run the Draconian Empire, right? But for sure, they want to retreat. So the force field over the cities is dropped. The Draconian troops that are still alive are beamed up to the ships, and the ships leave at warp speed. The lobstermen are left behind on Earth. Well, I mean, almost all of them are dead. A few of them are not dead. And they're just left for dead so that the humans will finish them off. Because that is still, by the way, the reptilian supremacists are still getting rid of the lobstermen race. You know what I mean? They just were useful to them for a hot second there. So the good guys then take John Redbridge to the castle that was that very last adventure that Jay ran in high school before he joined the army. That was the last game Jay ever ran. There was this castle with a secret room that it had sort of like a small, like a swimming pool kind of a thing in there with water that glowed blue that could heal. And so everybody, all the surviving player characters are like, we need to get John Redbridge to the sword room right now. And they do. And they put him in the water and nothing happens. And then this was the other thing we had cashed in was back when we were doing the White Wolf stuff, John Redbridge actually killed Cain. And in White Wolf, Cain was the first vampire, but he is also the Cain from the Bible. And it is said that, you know, whoever kills Cain is going to die themselves, right? And so this is it. And so that kind of mandate or whatever you want to call it overrides what the sword pool normally does. So this is really it. And this is really the end of the character. And they have him in the water here. And the blood is pumping out of his chest and stuff. And the last thing that he says to everybody, he gives the sword to Rad and says, "You're the new guy. Take care of everybody. You know, it's all on your shoulders now." And then he apologizes to everybody here. He says, I'm so sorry I wasn't a better man. That I had my ups and downs over the years, but I'm sorry for the dark times. I'm sorry for everything I ever did, and I hope you guys will forgive me. And they didn't even care about the bad stuff. But I liked that he had felt so guilty and it had weighed on him so heavily over the years, every mistake he ever made, that those were his final words. So he dies. He dies right there in the sword pool in the castle. And he's kind of happy to die because through the years he would meet women like in ancient Ireland. He would meet a woman and fall in love and have kids with her and stuff like that. And ultimately he buried all of them because he outlived everybody, right? And he kept doing that over and over again. And all the way up through, he had so many friends in like World War II, guys like Alan Scott. He outlived him. He went to Alan Scott's funeral, just over and over again. It was the same story. And he'd been tired of living for a long time. So he dies with a smile on his face. He was sort of worried he never would die. So he's happy to die while simultaneously feeling bad for, like I said, not having been a better man. But there at the very end, he has kind of a look of relief, and that's his final moment. And it was also a big deal because we mentioned before he had a harem. We also mentioned at one point that there were multiple Supergirls involved, and some of them had the ability to absorb other characters. Like we see the Linda Danvers Supergirl do that in the 90s, right? So one of the things the harem did was they had the ability to sort of merge into one being. And if that's confusing, think of Firestorm from DC, right? How he's Ronnie Raymond and he's Martin Stein, but they merge together and then they're Firestorm, right? So the harem had this ability to merge, and the name we gave her is just the word harem backwards. So Mara, right? And then she had died that day as well. So it's like you've got sort of like the king and the queen, so to speak, of our game world, and they're both gone now. So a little bit of time passes, and people are fighting in the Draconian Empire. I mean, people are fighting about who the next leader is going to be. And so this one guy named Zacchaeus is wanting to run the show. And he is actually the son of Tiamat and Old Scratch. And so he has multiple heads like a Hydra. He's totally red, as opposed to Zaxxas, who is green. And Zacchaeus is kind of young, but because he's um like being the son of Tiamat, for instance, stuff like that means he's hot stuff, right? So he orders another attack on Earth. Like, their defenses are low. We should not have fallen back. Let's wipe out humanity once and for all. And so the fleet goes back. And then to go back to Transformers the movie, this is sort of the moment where Galvatron and his new troops show up and attack Earth. Again, this is not Zaxxas. This is a brand new character. Um, but it's kind of he's doing that same thing, right? So they attack, and part of it is Zacchaeus wants Excalibur really bad. And because he knows this is the thing that killed Zaxxas. So he wants it. And Rad has it. So Rad gets in a ship, and two ships leave Earth. One of them being the current Nematon. And they go out into space, And so two really major things happen at this juncture. One ship accidentally runs into the old ones. And that was a huge deal because we had not seen them since the very first adventure on the channel, right? And so the old ones look like these kind of like fat frogmen sitting in like a metallic throne that hovers. And they don't have like a human like personality at all. So when the characters are interacting with these guys, um, they kind of are trying to say stuff to them like, hey, you created John Redbridge. Can you like fix him or something? Can you bring him back? And they have no desire to even try because their whole thing there is like he's nameless cannon fodder. Like, why would you care? Like we made him to fight in a war that we just lost interest in. Like we don't care at all. So that is that encounter. And then the other ship that actually has John Redbridge and Mara in the ship's sick bay, they go to this completely other world, which is I'm trying to remember what we called it. I think we called it Cemeterium. I found a Latin, it was basically like a Latin word for cemetery or graveyard or something like that. And they encounter zombies here. And for the heroes, that's not really a problem. They're able to shoot the zombies and stuff like that. But there's something about this planet, there's like energy or whatever, that even if you shoot a zombie, they will get up and keep going again. Like you quote unquote killed it, but it resurrects or whatever, right? And so while they're here in sick bay, the body of John Redbridge opens his eyes. And then the body of Mara does the exact same thing. And the names we gave these characters were Zamara for the girl. And since Arthur and Beowulf and Oberon and all that stuff, since that all means bear, and that was one of his nicknames over the years, was a lot of people just referred to him as the bear. We called him Zombear then. And so he opens his eyes. And so they kind of shamble out of the ship. But the thing is, they remember, like, they think they remember who they used to be, right? And the heroes talk to them, and the heroes end up leaving. They get off of the planet. And for a hot minute there, Zombear thinks he really is the bear. He thinks he really is John Redbridge. And he's like, but he looks in a mirror and he can see his chest is like open and like he doesn't have any blood in his body anymore and stuff like that. And so there's like a really sad moment actually. And by the way, everybody loved Zombear. He became a fan favorite character like real quick. But he realized that the soul had moved on. That he had no soul anymore. And he's like, "Oh, I'm just a reanimated corpse." And like I just happen to have that guy's memory engrams in my head, but those are somebody else's memories. And since we had ran this part of the time in Changeling the Dreaming, one of the big ideas in Changeling is that a character is like there's kind of two characters. There's sort of like the human body in a way, which they call the mortal seeming. And then the changeling himself, which is what Dagda would be, is what they call the fairy mean, M-I-E-N, by the way. And so the real John Redbridge is the fairy mean. It's gone. It really is gone, you know. So this is just the mortal seeming has fallen under the planet's ability to animate dead. So it's not the same guy, and he realizes that. And like it was kind of interesting. And so he wants to, for instance, love the children of John Redbridge like a father would. But then at the same time, he's kind of like, wow, I guess you're not really my kids. Like, that's weird. And he's just such a tragic character. Like, people loved Zombear and Zamira. And so they end up going to um, the Draconian Empire. They take the fight to them. And instead of at the end of Transformers the movie where they blow up Unicron, which is a planet that can turn into a Transformer, we just said that Rad takes the fight to the Draconians and just blew up their home world. You know, that was the analog. And that like crippled the Draconian Empire. And it was also kind of Rad's way of saying he wasn't as merciful as his father was. You know, like you guys killed my dad. And like Rad was always more of a butt kicker than his dad, actually. He's, yeah, I don't want to make him sound like a jerk, but I'm just saying he's more of a character in line with somebody like say the Punisher. You know what I mean? Like not a villain, but just like, but he's going to finish this. And he's none too happy these guys killed his dad and stuff. So they do that and they take out the Draconian homeworld and it cripples the Draconian Empire. And it's basically meant as like a um you know, if you come back to Earth and you try this again, like I will repay that debt tenfold. Like whatever you do, I'm going to go bigger. And like Rad is pretty much like I will kill every last dragon happily and sleep like a baby, you know. And so the Draconians are kind of like, hey, maybe we stop. And so the ones that were following Zacchaeus are not wanting to do that so much anymore. And then Patrick, who at this point in his life can turn into a were dragon, Patrick's kind of making a bid for, well, maybe I should run things, you know? And there's a lot of people that are like, we kind of like Patrick. Maybe we want to follow him, you know, because following Zacchaeus got our homeworld blown up. So that's what the bad guys are doing. The bad guys are kind of out of commission for a while. The good guys go back to Earth and they have a funeral for John Redbridge. And to kind of cement the idea that he is not Zombear, we had two characters at the funeral that were really noteworthy. So one is Zoriel from the Justice League, because in the Justice League comics, Zoriel literally made this like embassy in Los Angeles that was like an embassy for heaven. And he would, like, people would go to this place when a family member had died and they missed them. And he would literally take them to heaven so that they could, like, spend a day visiting someone they missed, which I was blown away that DC went there, you know, because I feel like it really messes a lot of stuff up. But since it was a DC thing, we went with it. And then the other character who can kind of do something similar is the 90s Supergirl, the main one, not one of the clones or whatever. Because Lex Luthor created a bunch of clones and they were in the harem. Like I said, they were why we could merge harem girls and blah, 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 blah. But this is the original, right? Who is married to um the the 80s Superboy, who grew up and he was Superman for a while, but then he was exposed to gold kryptonite by Dr. Manhattan, and now he's not Superman anymore. Point being, that guy's wife, right? She can kind of do that too. So then at the end, like they do the funeral, But then they like go actually visit John Redbridge in heaven. And that was kind of the epilogue. And that was meant to make the players kind of feel better about it, right? And when we ran it in the year 2000 or whatever, like people were emotional. And these were all male players in their 20s at the time. And they were like really emotional, actually. Well, so to go back where I was earlier, so now I kind of reran the game in a way while I was in the hospital on oxygen. And the doctors were saying I was not long for this world, right? And so I ran it over Skype or whatever. I don't know what program we use now, but I ran it for my wife and my daughter. And of course, they're just crying and crying and crying. And I ran it for my son. And um, yeah. And it hit different. You know, it's one thing to run that game when you're a young man and you're in great health and so on and so forth. It's a whole other thing to run it from a hospital room when the doctor's saying you're never going to leave this room alive, you know? And that was I ran it because they didn't have the heart to do anything with it. And I was trying to take care of stuff, you know. I was trying to get rid of the character that I thought was going to be emotional for them once I was gone. And then to my surprise, you know, I was in there for, man, I don't know. I want to say I was in there for like 2 weeks. They had like no intentions of letting me leave. And I started to feel better, and they still weren't going to let me leave. And then I was talking with people at home over Skype, and my whole family had had it at that point, and they were doing really, really bad. And my wife couldn't breathe, and her brother was living with us at the time, and he couldn't breathe. And then the irony was, because I was really worried about them. And so the irony was something came on the TV in the hospital room about how you can check yourself out of a hospital, that the hospital can't force you to stay. And I didn't, I never knew that. And so the nurse came in and I said, you know, are you guys going to let me out like anytime soon? And she's like, I don't think so. And I said, okay. And I was like, well, I just saw this on TV. Is this thing true? And she's like, yeah. And she was kind of weird about admitting it, but she's like, yeah. And I said, well, I want to do that then. And she's like, well, we advise against it. And I was like, my family needs me. And so she went and got the paperwork and brought it to me. And I signed the thing and I left. And I went home, and my brother-in-law, I've mentioned before, he has a lot of mental problems and he's on so many different kinds of meds for these problems of his. And that was not at all mixing with him being sick with this, right? And literally, like, I no sooner got in the door than he turned on the burners of our stove. So the burners were like all on high, they were hot. And then he laid down without a shirt on, he laid down on the stove and was just out of his mind and was going to cook himself on the stove. So I got him off of there, and he was just covered in sweat. And like the look in his eyes was like he didn't even know who I was. And I called 911 and an ambulance came out and they took him to the hospital. And the irony is they put him in the room I had just left. He was in my room. Um, and then they hung on to him for 2 weeks or something. And then my wife, they brought a thing out and they put her on oxygen. So her and her brother were both on oxygen. And I don't know, we all recovered from it then. And we talked about, should we bring, John Redbridge back or whatever. And I was like, I don't think we should, because it's a good death. It's a good death. And I hate for there to not be consequences and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, we left it. And then the upshot of it was I played Zombear, and I played him differently than I ever played John Redbridge. John Redbridge always had a bit of a twinkle in his eye. He had this kind of cocky, mischievous thing where he always felt like he was on top of any situation and stuff like that. But like in a friendly, charismatic sort of a way. That's not at all what we did with Zombear. Zombear was like, he was always sad. He had had the wind completely taken out of his sails. Um, he was never cocky. He was um never quite sure what to do. He was never quite sure who he was. He struggled with his sense of self, that he didn't want to just be doing like an impression of this other guy whose body he got as kind of a hand-me-down in a way. Um, so he's a very interesting guy. We haven't done too many games with Zombear. And then the other thing, I think I forgot to mention it, is, like I said, in Changeling the Dreaming, your powers come from your fairy soul, right? So without the fairy soul, the body had no powers at all. Completely none whatsoever. Um, so he was a street level guy. And then that was weird for everybody too, because they were used to him being like a massive heavy hitter. Now he wasn't. So at any rate, that's it, man. That's the that's the day we killed the big guy. But he's got a legacy. He's got, like I said, kids and stuff left behind. Um, so even when he's not here, his effect is always going to be felt in the game world, you know? So we thought this one was very interesting. We hope that you thought it was interesting too. If so, as always, we would love it if you took just a moment of your time to support the channel by smashing that like button, leaving us a comment, and as always, check to see if you're still subscribed. YouTube loves to unsubscribe you without telling you about it. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.